"Give me 2 minutes," Nico Salvati murmured, one hand resting at the small of Marin Cole's back, the other lifting her chin gently enough that she stopped mid-apology about the spilled tray. Every table in the restaurant had gone quiet, forks suspended halfway to mouths, servers frozen near the kitchen doors, because in 3 years of running this city's most dangerous shipping empire from a corner booth, nobody had ever seen Nico touch an employee like that, slow, deliberate, protective, in front of an entire dining room of people who owed him money, favors, or their silence. What none of them understood, watching him hold a plus-size waitress close enough that her trembling finally stopped, was that he wasn't comforting her over broken glass. He was making sure the man 3 tables over, the one who'd just grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave a mark, understood exactly how close he'd come to losing his hand. Marin Cole had been working at Lucky's for 2 years, ever since a diner 2 blocks over closed, and took her steady paycheck with it. She'd waited tables since she was 19, worked through 2 moves, 1 bad breakup, and a mother whose hospital bills never seemed to shrink no matter how many double shifts Marin picked up. She was good at the job in the specific way exhausted. Competent people become good at things nobody thanks them for, remembering orders without writing them down, reading a table's mood before they'd finished sitting, absorbing rude comments about her size or her pace with a practiced, professional calm that cost her more than anyone in that restaurant ever considered. She hadn't chosen Lucky's because of its reputation. She'd chosen it because it paid better than anywhere else within walking distance of her apartment, and because after 6 months there, she'd learned not to ask too many questions about the quiet corner booth that was always reserved, always empty until exactly 9 in the evening, always attended by 2 men in dark suits who tipped generously and never made small talk. She hadn't learned, not for a long time, exactly who sat in that booth or what he did outside those walls. She only knew him as a customer who always said thank you, who remembered that she preferred to be called Marin instead of the nickname the owner insisted on using, and who once, quietly, without making a scene of it, told the kitchen staff to remake an order rather than let her get blamed for someone else's mistake. Nico Salvati noticed her long before she noticed him, in any way that mattered. He noticed the way she moved through the restaurant with a kind of tired grace, the way she never let a rude comment change her expression, the way she always checked on the elderly regulars at table 6 before checking on anyone paying a bigger bill. He'd built an empire on reading people quickly, on knowing exactly who was worth his attention and who wasn't, and something about Marin Cole had, over 18 months of quiet observation, become the single most consistent thing in a life built almost entirely on calculated unpredictability. He never said anything about it. That would have meant explaining feelings he barely allowed himself to examine, let alone voice, to a woman who worked for tips in a restaurant he happened to frequent for reasons that had, gradually, stopped being about the food entirely. The night everything changed started like any other Thursday. The dinner rush had thinned into the slower, heavier evening crowd, tables of businessmen finishing late meetings, a scattering of couples, and near the bar, a man named Grant de la Croix, who had been drinking steadily for the better part of 2 hours and growing louder with every round. Marin had served his table twice already, politely declining his increasingly unsubtle comments about her figure with the same practiced neutrality she'd perfected over a decade of waitressing. She'd learned, long ago, that engaging with men like Grant only encouraged them, and that the safest path through an evening like this was quiet efficiency, minimal eye contact, and getting through her shift without incident. It nearly worked. She was clearing his table for a 3rd time, reaching for an empty glass, when Grant's hand shot out and closed around her wrist, hard enough that she gasped, hard enough that the tray in her other hand tipped, sending 2 plates and a wine glass crashing to the floor in a bright, echoing shatter that cut through every conversation in the restaurant. "Hey," Grant said, his voice thick with alcohol, his grip tightening rather than loosening as Marin instinctively pulled back. "I was talking to you." "Sir, please let go of my wrist. You've been ignoring me all night." "That's rude, sweetheart, for someone built like." He didn't finish the sentence. Nico was out of the corner booth and across the restaurant floor before most of the other diners had even fully registered what was happening, moving with the kind of controlled, economical speed that made the two men who normally flanked his booth stand instantly, instinctively, without needing to be told. He didn't grab Grant. He didn't need to. He simply appeared beside the table, close enough that his presence alone made Grant's grip on Marin's wrist loosen and finally release, and said, in a voice so quiet that only the nearest tables could actually hear the words, "You're going to want to take your hand off her wrist right now, and then you're going to want to leave." Grant, drunk enough to be slow but not drunk enough to miss the sudden, absolute silence that had fallen over the entire dining room, or the way every member of staff had gone very still, looked up at Nico with the particular confusion of a man realizing, too late, exactly whose restaurant he'd chosen to make a scene in. "I didn't mean anything by it," he stammered. "We were just talking." "You were hurting her," Nico said, still quiet, still perfectly controlled, though something behind his eyes had gone cold in a way that made even the bartender, 20 feet away, find something urgent to do with the glasses in front of him. "There's a considerable difference." Grant's friends, sensing exactly how badly this had gone, were already pulling him toward the door, offering rushed apologies to no one in particular, leaving cash on the table that nobody would bother collecting. Within 30 seconds, the table was empty, the door had swung shut behind them, and the restaurant remained in a silence so complete that the sound of Marin's shaking breath was audible from several tables away. Nico turned to her immediately, his expression shifting from the cold, controlled fury he'd shown Grant to something considerably gentler, though no less intense. "Are you hurt?" Marin shook her head, though her wrist throbbed where Grant's fingers had dug in, and her hands, she realized distantly, were trembling badly enough that she nearly dropped the empty tray she was still somehow holding. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed exactly how untrue that was. "I need to clean this up. I'm so sorry about the mess, I'll get someone to." "Marin." Nico's voice cut gently through her rising panic, and before she quite understood what was happening, he had taken the tray from her shaking hands, set it aside, and stepped close enough that his hand came to rest at the small of her back, steady and warm, while his other hand tilted her chin up just enough to meet his eyes. "Give me 2 minutes," he said quietly, only to her, though the entire restaurant was still watching, still frozen in the aftermath of what had just happened. "You don't have to clean anything up right now. You don't have to apologize for anything. You just have to breathe." Marin stared at him, acutely aware of every eye in the restaurant fixed on the two of them, aware of how completely, publicly out of character this was for a man who had spent 18 months maintaining careful, professional distance no matter how many times she'd caught him watching her a beat longer than any regular customer should. "Everyone's staring," she whispered. "Let them," Nico said, and didn't move away. For a long moment, he simply held her there, steady, close, his hand warm against her back, until the trembling in her shoulders finally, gradually, eased. Nobody in the restaurant moved. Nobody spoke. Even the two men who normally flanked his booth stood several feet back, watching the door, watching the room, giving the two of them a kind of unspoken privacy that felt, to Marin, both surreal and, somehow, exactly right. "Better?" Nico asked finally, quiet enough that it was almost just for her. "A little," Marin admitted. "I don't understand what just happened." "Someone hurt you in my restaurant," Nico said simply. "I wasn't going to let that stand." "Your restaurant?" Something flickered across his expression, the realization, perhaps, that he'd said more than he'd intended. "I own the building. The restaurant operates under a different name. But yes, mine." Marin blinked, processing that piece of information alongside everything else that had just happened, the wrist that still ached, the shattered glass at her feet, the sudden, dizzying reality that the quiet, generous regular she'd served for 18 months apparently owned the entire establishment and had just, in front of every diner present, made it unmistakably clear that she mattered to him in some way she'd never let herself consider. "I need to sit down," she said. Nico guided her, without asking, toward the empty corner booth that had, for 18 months, been reserved exclusively for him, and settled her into the seat across from where he usually sat, sliding in beside her rather than across, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. "I'll have someone bring you water," he said, and one of the men near the door was already moving toward the bar before Nico finished the sentence. "And I'll have someone deal with the mess. You don't need to worry about your shift for the rest of tonight. I can't just stop working, I need this job." "You're not being fired, Marin." His voice was gentle but firm, the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed without needing to raise his voice. "You're taking the rest of the night off, paid, because a customer grabbed you hard enough to bruise, and no employer with any sense would expect you to keep smiling through tables after that." Marin looked down at her wrist, where faint red marks were already beginning to darken, and felt something complicated tighten in her chest, gratitude tangled up with confusion, tangled up with an awareness, sudden and overwhelming, of exactly how close Nico was sitting, exactly how careful and deliberate his attention had been for longer than she'd let herself notice. "Why did you do that?" she asked quietly. "In front of everyone. You could have just told your men to handle it quietly." Nico was silent for a long moment, considering the question with more weight than it might have seemed to warrant. "I could have," he agreed finally. "I've spent 18 months being very careful not to draw attention to how much I've come to care what happens to you, Marin. Tonight, watching him grab you like that, I stopped being careful." Marin's breath caught. 18 months. "Since the second week you started here." A faint, almost self-deprecating smile crossed his face. "I told myself, for a long time, that I simply appreciated good service. Eventually I had to admit that wasn't entirely honest." She stared at him, the noise of the restaurant gradually resuming around them as staff began quietly clearing the broken glass, as diners returned, cautiously, to their own conversations, though every glance still drifted, occasionally, toward the corner booth where their reserved, mysterious regular sat close beside the waitress everyone had just watched him defend. "I had no idea," Marin admitted. "I was very careful for you to have no idea," Nico said. "It seemed, for a long time, easier that way." "Easier for who?" "For me, mostly." He looked at her directly, something in his expression more open than she had ever seen from him in 18 months of quiet, careful observation. "I've spent my entire adult life in a world where caring about someone specific creates a vulnerability I've been taught, since I was very young, to avoid. I told myself watching you work, tipping generously, occasionally making sure the kitchen treated you fairly, cost me nothing. It was easier to believe that than to admit I'd started arranging my entire week around which nights you were scheduled." Marin felt heat rise in her face despite the lingering ache in her wrist, despite the surreal strangeness of the entire evening. "You've been checking my schedule." "I own the building," Nico said, with the faintest hint of dry humor. "It wasn't difficult." Before she could respond, one of his men returned with a glass of water and, quietly, a small first aid kit that he set discreetly on the table before retreating again to give them space. Nico reached for it without asking, taking her injured wrist gently in his hands, checking the developing bruise with careful, precise attention. "This is going to hurt for a few days," he said quietly. "I'd like you to see a doctor tomorrow, just to be certain nothing's fractured. I'll arrange it, if you'll let me." "You don't have to do all this." "I know I don't have to." He met her eyes again. "I want to." The rest of that evening passed in a strange, quiet blur for Marin, Nico insisting she stay in the corner booth rather than return to her shift, the restaurant staff treating her with a new, careful deference that made it clear exactly how much the incident, and Nico's response to it, had shifted the way they understood her place in the establishment. By the time her replacement server finished the closing shift and the last diners filtered out into the night, Marin found herself sitting across from a man she'd served food to for 18 months and had never once truly known. "Can I drive you home?" Nico asked, as the restaurant staff began the final closing routines around them. "You don't need to. I take the bus." "I know you take the bus," Nico said. "I also know it stops running in 11 minutes, and given everything that's happened tonight, I'd feel considerably better knowing you got home safely rather than waiting alone at a bus stop with a bruised wrist." Marin considered arguing, out of habit more than conviction, and found she didn't actually want to. "All right," she said finally. "Thank you." The drive to her apartment was quiet, comfortable in a way that surprised her, Nico's driver navigating familiar streets while the two of them sat in the backseat, close but not touching, the events of the evening settling slowly around them like dust after a storm. "Can I ask you something?" Marin said, as the car turned onto her street. "Of course." "What exactly do you do? I mean, I've served you dinner for 18 months and I genuinely don't know what your job is, beyond apparently owning restaurants." Nico was quiet for a moment, weighing, she sensed, exactly how much of an answer to give. "I run a shipping company," he said carefully. "Legitimate, on paper. Considerably more complicated underneath that, in ways I'd rather not detail on our first honest conversation." "That's not really an answer." "No," Nico agreed. "It isn't. But it's the most honest one I can give you tonight, and I'd rather be partially honest than fully dishonest, if you're willing to accept that for now." Marin studied him in the passing streetlight, considering the careful, guarded weight behind his answer, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she believed him anyway. "All right," she said. "For now." He walked her to her apartment door, waited until she was safely inside before returning to the car, and it was only after she'd locked the door behind her, sitting alone in her small kitchen with ice wrapped around her aching wrist, that Marin allowed herself to fully process the strange, dizzying reality of everything that had happened, the humiliation of Grant's grip on her wrist, the shock of watching Nico cross an entire restaurant floor to defend her, the quiet, startling intimacy of being held close in front of dozens of witnesses by a man who had apparently spent 18 months quietly, carefully falling for her without ever saying a word. She didn't sleep well that night. She wasn't sure, lying awake at 2 in the morning, whether it was the lingering ache in her wrist or the memory of his hand steady against her back that kept her mind circling long after exhaustion should have pulled her under. The following days brought changes Marin hadn't anticipated. Nico arranged, exactly as promised, for a doctor to examine her wrist, confirming a bad sprain rather than a fracture, and insisted, over her repeated objections, on covering the cost entirely. He appeared at the restaurant less predictably than his usual 9 o'clock reservation, sometimes arriving mid-afternoon during her slower shifts, always finding a reason to speak with her, however briefly, always careful, still, not to make her uncomfortable with attention she hadn't explicitly welcomed. It was during one of these visits, 4 days after the incident, that Marin finally asked the question that had been sitting, unspoken, since the night everything changed. "Why me?" she asked, refilling his water glass during a quiet mid-afternoon lull, the restaurant nearly empty around them. "I mean it genuinely, Nico. You could have anyone. Why spend 18 months quietly watching a waitress you never even talked to beyond your order?" Nico set down the glass, considering the question with the same careful weight he seemed to give everything important. "Because you're the only person in my life who has never once wanted anything from me," he said finally. "Everyone else, business partners, associates, even some of the people I consider friends, they want something. Access, favors, protection, information. You brought me the same meal every Thursday for 18 months and never once asked me for anything beyond a fair tip. That's just doing my job. It's more than that, and you know it." He met her eyes steadily. "You remember which regulars are struggling and quietly comp their coffee when the owner isn't watching. You've never once let anyone's rudeness change how carefully you do your work. You stayed exactly, entirely yourself, week after week, in an industry that grinds most people down into something considerably smaller." He paused. "I've spent my entire adult life around people who perform whatever version of themselves they think will get them what they want. You never once performed anything for me. I found that considerably more compelling than I expected to." Marin felt something warm and unfamiliar settle in her chest, listening to him, the strange, dizzying sense of being truly seen by someone she'd assumed, for 18 months, barely registered her existence beyond good service. "I don't know what to say to that," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Nico said. I only wanted you to understand why I crossed that restaurant floor the way I did. It wasn't a performance either. 3 weeks passed in a slow, careful unfolding neither of them rushed. Nico's visits to the restaurant becoming a fixture Marin found herself, despite every instinct toward caution, quietly looking forward to. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give, never made her feel pressured by the strange, public spectacle their moment in the corner booth had created among the restaurant's regular clientele, several of whom now watched the two of them with open, unashamed curiosity every time Nico's car pulled up outside. It was during the 4th week, on a quiet Tuesday evening, that the second crisis arrived, one that would reveal exactly how much danger existed on the periphery of the careful, quiet life Nico had built. Marin was closing out the register near the end of her shift when the restaurant's front door opened and a man she didn't recognize stepped inside, well-dressed, calm, entirely out of place among the evening's remaining diners. He didn't sit. He walked directly toward the corner booth where Nico sat reviewing paperwork with one of his usual men, and the entire atmosphere of the restaurant shifted instantly, the way it always did when something serious was unfolding beneath the surface of an otherwise ordinary evening. Marin couldn't hear the conversation from behind the register, but she watched Nico's expression harden, watched the paperwork get swept aside, watched him stand abruptly, his hand instinctively moving toward his jacket in a gesture she'd never seen from him before and understood, with sudden clarity, exactly what it meant. The stranger left as quickly as he'd arrived. Nico remained standing at the booth for a long moment, his jaw tight, before crossing the restaurant floor toward the register where Marin stood, frozen, watching. I need to leave, he said quietly. Something's happened that requires my immediate attention. Is everything all right? No, Nico said honestly, which surprised her more than a reassuring lie would have. One of my shipping routes was compromised tonight. A rival operation, I suspect, though I won't know for certain until I've looked into it myself. He hesitated, something conflicted crossing his expression. I don't want to leave you here without understanding that this, the danger that exists on the edges of my life, isn't something that stays neatly separate from the parts of my life I'd rather keep simple. Grant grabbing your wrist was an ordinary, ugly moment that could happen to anyone. This is different. This is the world I actually live in. Marin studied him carefully, understanding, for the first time with full weight, exactly what she was choosing to step toward if she chose to step toward him at all. Are you telling me this because you want me to walk away? I'm telling you this because you deserve to know exactly what you'd be choosing before you choose it, Nico said. I won't blame you if tonight changes how you feel about any of this. Marin was quiet for a long moment, weighing the fear that had settled cold in her stomach against the memory of his hand steady at her back 3 weeks earlier, against 18 months of quiet, careful attention that had never once asked anything of her, against the strange, undeniable certainty that had been building in her chest since the night he'd crossed an entire restaurant floor without hesitation. Go handle whatever you need to handle, she said finally. I'll still be here when you get back, if that's what you're asking. Something eased in Nico's expression, relief mixed with a gratitude he didn't quite have words for. I'll call you tomorrow, he said. I promise. He didn't call the next day. He didn't call the day after that either, and by the 3rd day, Marin found herself checking her phone with an anxiety she hadn't expected to feel over a man she'd known, in any real sense, for less than a month. The restaurant's regular patrons noticed the empty corner booth too, whispering among themselves about the sudden absence of the mysterious man who'd caused such a scene weeks earlier. It was Marcus, one of the 2 men who usually flanked Nico's booth, who finally appeared at the restaurant on the 4th evening, waiting quietly near the entrance until Marin's shift ended. He asked me to bring you somewhere, Marcus said, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told her nothing about whether this was good news or bad. He's all right. I want you to know that before we go anywhere. He's all right, but he's been dealing with something serious, and he wanted to see you himself rather than explain it over the phone. The drive took them out of the city entirely, toward a private property Marin hadn't known existed, a modest, heavily secured house surrounded by trees rather than the ostentatious estate she might have expected from a man in Nico's position. Marcus led her inside, through a quiet hallway, to a study where Nico sat behind a desk covered in documents, a bandage visible at his temple, a bruise darkening along his jaw that he hadn't bothered to hide. "You're hurt," Marin said immediately, crossing the room before she'd fully decided to move at all. "It looks worse than it is," Nico said, though the careful way he shifted in his chair suggested otherwise. The shipping route that was compromised, it turned out to be more than an isolated incident. A rival operation has been testing my territory for months, and this week they decided to escalate from testing to something considerably more direct. "What happened?" "An attempt was made on one of my warehouses," Nico said, his voice carefully controlled in the way she'd come to recognize as his method of managing things that frightened him more than he wanted to admit. "I was there when it happened. It didn't go the way they planned, for them." Marin sat down slowly in the chair across from his desk, absorbing the weight of what he was describing, the reality of exactly what kind of danger existed in the life he tried to warn her about days earlier. "Are they going to come after you again?" "Probably," Nico admitted. "Which is why I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, because the answer changes how much distance I need to keep between my world and yours." "Ask me. Do you want to keep seeing me?" His voice carried none of the careful confidence she'd grown accustomed to, replaced by something more uncertain, more genuinely afraid of her answer than he'd been of whatever had happened at that warehouse. "Because if you do, I need you to understand that people who target me will eventually learn who matters to me, and that puts you in a position of risk I have no right to ask you to accept." Marin looked at him, bruised and careful and more honest with her in that moment than he'd been in 18 months of quiet, distant observation, and felt the last of her hesitation dissolve into something considerably more certain. "I spent 4 days barely sleeping because you didn't call," she said. "I don't think distance is something I actually want, Nico, even knowing what it might cost me. It could cost you considerably more than sleepless nights." "I know that." She held his gaze steadily. "I watched a man grab my wrist hard enough to bruise it, and I watched you cross an entire restaurant floor without a second hesitation to make sure it never happened again. I don't think I'm interested in pretending that moment didn't mean something just because the rest of your life is complicated." Nico was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression that carried more vulnerability than she'd ever seen from him. "I'll increase security around the restaurant, and around your apartment," he said finally. "I need you to trust that I'll handle whatever comes from this, and I need you to tell me immediately if anything feels wrong, anyone unfamiliar showing interest in you, any strange questions from customers, anything at all." "I can do that. And I need you to know," he added, quieter now, "that whatever this costs eventually, I don't regret a single moment of the last 18 months, including the parts where I was too careful to say anything at all." Marin reached across the desk, taking his hand gently, mindful of the bruises she could see and the ones she suspected she couldn't. "Neither do I," she said. "Now tell me what actually happened at that warehouse, because I'd rather know the truth than spend another 4 days imagining something worse." He told her. Not everything, she understood, not the full, complicated architecture of an empire built across decades and generations, but enough, a rival operation run by a man named Silas Renner who had spent the better part of a year quietly encroaching on Nico's shipping routes, testing defenses, probing for weaknesses, finally escalating to a direct assault on one of the warehouses that formed the backbone of Nico's legitimate business interests. The assault had failed, decisively, Nico's security team better prepared and better trained than Renner's men had anticipated, but the message had been unmistakable regardless of the outcome. Renner intended to continue pushing until something gave, and Nico's sudden, public attention toward a waitress at his favorite restaurant had not gone unnoticed by an organization that made a careful study of exactly this kind of vulnerability. "He knows about you," Nico said finally, the words costing him something visible. "One of Renner's people was seen near the restaurant 2 days before the warehouse incident. I don't believe it's a coincidence." Marin felt cold settle in her stomach, understanding, fully now, exactly what she'd agreed to when she told him she wanted to keep seeing him regardless of the risk. What do we do? I increase security. I make it clear, through channels Renner will understand, that any attempt to use you against me will be met with considerably more force than the warehouse incident. His jaw tightened. And I keep you as close as circumstances allow, rather than pretending distance protects you when it clearly doesn't. The weeks that followed brought a quiet, careful vigilance to Marin's daily life that she adjusted to with more resilience than she'd expected of herself. A car she hadn't requested but grew to recognize idled discreetly near the restaurant during her shifts. Marcus or one of Nico's other men appeared, casually, unobtrusively, at the bus stop she used most evenings, never announcing their presence but never entirely absent either. Nico visited more frequently now, no longer maintaining the careful, distant boundaries of 18 months of quiet observation, arriving sometimes for full meals, sometimes simply for the 15 minutes she could spare during a break, always attentive, always careful, the guarded man she'd served for a year and a half gradually revealing himself to be considerably warmer, considerably more present than she'd ever imagined possible. The confrontation with Renner, when it finally came, arrived not at the restaurant, but at the small apartment Marin had called home for 3 years, on an evening she'd expected to be entirely ordinary. She was walking home from her shift, later than usual after covering an extra table for a co-worker whose child had gotten sick, when a car she didn't recognize pulled alongside her on the quiet street 2 blocks from her building. A man stepped out, calm, unhurried, his expression carrying the particular confidence of someone who believed he held every advantage in the conversation about to unfold. "Miss Cole," he said, his voice pleasant in a way that made her skin crawl immediately. "I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." Marin's instincts, sharpened by weeks of careful vigilance, told her immediately who she was looking at. "I don't know you," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear tightening in her chest. "No, but I know a great deal about you." Silas Renner smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes at all. "I know you work at Lucchese. I know Nico Salvati has taken a considerable, unusual interest in you. I know you take this exact route home most evenings." He took a step closer. "I thought it might be useful for you to understand exactly how much of your life is currently visible to people who would very much like Nico to reconsider certain business decisions." "What do you want?" "I want you to deliver a message," Renner said. "Tell him that his warehouse was a warning. Tell him the next warning will be considerably less abstract and considerably closer to him personally, unless he agrees to relinquish the northern shipping routes by the end of the month." Marin's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her voice to remain level, drawing on years of practiced calm developed across a decade of waiting tables for people who had never once considered how much composure it required to smile through humiliation. "I'm a waitress," she said. "I don't have anything to do with his business decisions." "You have quite a lot to do with them now," Renner said, his voice taking on a colder edge. "Whether either of you intended it or not." It was at that exact moment, later than she would ever have imagined possible, that a second car turned onto the street, moving fast enough that Renner's confident expression finally, visibly cracked. Nico was out of the vehicle before it had fully stopped, and the fury that crossed his face at the sight of Renner standing close enough to Marin to touch her was unlike anything she'd witnessed from him before, colder and more absolute than the controlled anger he'd shown Grant Delacroix weeks earlier. "Get away from her," Nico said, his voice carrying a weight that made even Renner take an involuntary step back. "Nico," Renner said, recovering his composure with visible effort. "I was simply delivering a message." "You delivered it to the wrong person," Nico said, closing the distance between them with a controlled, deliberate speed that made Marcus, arriving a beat behind him, move immediately to Marin's side rather than toward the confrontation itself. "If you have business with me, you come to me directly. You do not approach someone who has nothing to do with our disagreement to make a point you're too cautious to make in person." I wanted to be certain the message would carry appropriate weight. "You've made your point," Nico said, his voice dropping to something considerably more dangerous than shouting would have been. Now you're going to leave, and you're going to understand that if you or anyone connected to your operation comes within 100 feet of this woman again, the warehouse will look like a considerably gentler outcome than what follows. Renner studied him for a long moment, weighing, visibly, exactly how seriously to take the threat, before retreating toward his car with the careful, unhurried dignity of a man determined not to appear as though he was fleeing, even though everyone present understood exactly what was happening. The car pulled away. The street fell silent, except for Marin's unsteady breathing and the distant sound of ordinary evening traffic several blocks over. Nico turned to her immediately, his fury dissolving into something considerably softer, considerably more frightened, now that the immediate threat had passed. Are you hurt? Did he touch you? I'm fine, Marin said, though her voice shook more than she wanted it to. He didn't touch me. He just talked. I should never have let this go on as long as it has, Nico said, his hands framing her face gently, checking, the way he had weeks earlier at the restaurant, for evidence of harm she kept insisting hadn't happened. I told myself increased security was enough. I should have ended this entirely, weeks ago, rather than risk exactly what just happened. You're here now, Marin said, steadying herself against the solid, warm presence of him. That's what matters. It shouldn't have taken this long to arrive. His jaw tightened with a self-directed anger considerably harsher than what he'd shown Renner. I have people watching this street specifically because I was afraid of exactly this. I was still 11 minutes too slow. 11 minutes where you got here at all, Marin said quietly. I think that counts for considerably more than you're giving yourself credit for. The confrontation with Renner, rather than ending the conflict, accelerated it toward a resolution neither of them could have predicted. Within 2 days, Nico had mobilized every resource at his disposal, not toward direct retaliation, which he explained carefully would only escalate the danger further, but toward a methodical, comprehensive effort to expose Renner's operation to the exact kind of legal and financial scrutiny that men like him depended on avoiding. It took 3 weeks of careful, quiet work, documentation gathered by men whose entire skill set involved discovering exactly what powerful people preferred to keep hidden, before Nico had assembled enough evidence of Renner's various illegal operations, expanded well beyond simple shipping route disputes into territory considerably more serious, to hand over to exactly the right federal contacts through channels that would never trace back to Nico himself. Renner's arrest, when it finally happened, made only a small item in the local business section, a story about financial irregularities and smuggling charges that gave no indication of the personal conflict that had actually precipitated the investigation. Marin read it twice, sitting in her small kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning, before setting the paper aside and allowing herself, for the first time in weeks, to fully exhale. It's over, she asked Nico that evening, when he arrived at the restaurant for what had become, gradually, an entirely ordinary Thursday dinner between them, no longer the careful, guarded ritual of 18 months of unspoken observation, but something considerably warmer, considerably more honest. His operation is finished, Nico confirmed. He'll be facing considerably more serious consequences than a business dispute with me. It's over, as much as anything in this life is ever entirely over. That's not very reassuring. It's honest, Nico said, reaching across the table to take her hand, a gesture that had become, over the preceding weeks, entirely natural between them. I'd rather give you honest than reassuring, Marin. I think you've earned that, considering everything the last 2 months have asked of you. Marin considered his words, considered the strange, unexpected shape her life had taken since the night a drunk man's careless cruelty had accidentally revealed 18 months of quiet, careful devotion she'd never once suspected existed. I think, she said slowly, that I'd rather have honest and complicated than simple and lonely. I spent a long time being very good at simple and lonely, and I didn't particularly enjoy it. Something in Nico's expression softened into an emotion she'd only recently learned to recognize on his careful, guarded features. I don't think I can offer you simple, he admitted. I can offer you honest and careful and considerably more attention than any waitress should reasonably expect from a corner booth regular. I think I can work with that, Marin said, smiling despite everything the last 2 months had cost her, despite the bruises that had long since faded from her wrist, despite the fear that still occasionally surfaced when unfamiliar cars idled too long near the restaurant. 6 months later, Luchis had settled into a rhythm considerably different from the one it had followed before that Thursday evening when everything changed. Marin no longer worked full shifts as often, her role gradually shifting, at Nico's careful, patient encouragement, toward managing the restaurant's operations more broadly, a position that used her decade of experience reading rooms and managing difficult situations in ways that finally, properly compensated the skill involved. The corner booth remained reserved most evenings, though these days it was rarely empty until 9, Nico arriving earlier, staying longer, the careful, distant boundaries of 18 months of quiet observation replaced entirely by something considerably more present. One evening, closing out the restaurant together after the last diners had gone, Marin found herself standing beside the same spot where Grant Delacroix's careless cruelty had first, accidentally, revealed everything Nico had spent so long keeping carefully hidden. I still think about that night sometimes, she admitted, watching him lock the front door, the restaurant quiet and dim around them. Which part? Nico asked, turning to face her. The part where you crossed the entire restaurant floor without hesitating for a second, she said. I keep thinking about how strange it is that something so ugly ended up being the beginning of something I wouldn't trade for anything now. Nico crossed the distance between them, the same deliberate, unhurried movement he'd shown that first night, and gathered her close, his hand settling at the small of her back exactly the way it had months earlier, though without any crisis demanding it this time, only the quiet, ordinary certainty of two people who had built something real out of 18 months of careful silence and one night neither of them could have predicted. I'd cross that floor again, he said quietly, every single time, without hesitating for a second longer than I did that night. I know, Marin said, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, familiar rhythm of his heartbeat. That's exactly why I'm still here. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary evening rhythms, entirely unaware of the quiet, extraordinary thing that had grown from one moment of cruelty and one man's refusal to let it stand, unnoticed, in the corner of a restaurant that had, for 18 careful months, been the only place either of them had ever felt fully, unguardedly themselves.